Thank you. So we'll have a kind of a 10-minute presentation briefly about the competition, about the decision of the jury. And we really wanted with this competition to start off by questioning why we actually built so many pavilions as architects. Like the pavilion has really become a kind of a staple for architects. We have, the Serpentine pavilions, we have MoMA PS1, we have the ICD pavilion. So there is this incredible yearly kind of output of pavilions. And they're always slightly also embroiled in kind of interesting debates and questions. Like, for example, this year at Serpentine, Jana Peel, the director of the Serpentine Gallery, had to resign just before the opening of the pavilion because she was invested in some dodgy military industry. The MoMA pavilions are famous that you win the pavilion, it costs, MoMA gives you $50,000 and then you need to find $500,000 to build this pavilion. And the ICD pavilion is nothing bad about it, but they're all a bit maybe engineering focused. So the question is really like, what is the status of these pavilions today? Why as architects do we want to build these pavilions? And what are we looking for when we build those? So when we set up the brief, we actually wanted to not build a pavilion. So every time I say pavilion, it's a Freudian lapse, because this is actually not a pavilion. The primitive hut is something that asks architects to consider the most kind of primordial type of dwelling or building. It has a very interesting, I think, economic relationship to material. There's always a certain aspect of austerity in the primitive hut. It's always the kind of the minimum decision-making where you go from material that is somehow found and you add an architectural intent and a kind of a minimum amount of tooling to it, and then you kind of build the pavilion. So it's never really a folly as much as maybe the pavilions that we see today, right? So there is also this kind of aspect to the primitive hut that it wants to be universal. And the primitive hut, despite being primitive, is always innovative. Almost per definition, in its primitivity, it's always a kind of a first, right? So I thought this primitive hut was a kind of an interesting way to reframe the competition. Of course, it's a bit of a cliche as well in architecture, like it appears every 5 years or every 10 years, it comes kind of back and haunts us as architects to kind of, it's like a reminder that our profession is in one way serious and that we need to take this question serious. And what I was just really interested in kind of looking at these ones, this kind of primitive huts, this kind of the minimal action to make something inhabitable, where you almost go straight from nature or straight from resources to architecture, right? And you can look at the primitive hut, as this kind of old prehistoric structures, but you can also really think about, for example, this domino here in Greece as a kind of a form of a modern day primitive hut, a model that has kind of spread around the world. And the domino is for me pretty much like definitely one of the most successful primitive huts. It's modern, but it's a model that is, again, like it's so limited in its decision-making that it's kind of on the edge of being either really stupid or really, really intelligent, which are these kind of qualities that we were interested in. And of course, when I did the pavilion 2 years ago, the ambition was that it was not a pavilion, but it was this kind of domino-like model. And again, like the primitive hut does not exclude any innovation. I think this kind of dialectic between a 3D printed building and an actual hut brings up this kind of tension of what is actually primitive, what is innovative today, right? So this kind of primordiality of these ideas. So despite being primitive, every primitive hut is also innovative. And there was also this idea that we could really approach beauty and the brief that Gilles Retsin had set up through beauty being really embedded in the initial decision-making. That's really inseparable from the material organization, so that it's a kind of a tectonic beauty, which again maybe is quite an old notion of beauty, but I think it's fundamental to our profession. And then what is of course important, which was mentioned before, is this kind of, with the primitive hut, there is a certain economic consequence in the system. So we were really interested in trying to look at these pavilions and trying, although they are very small, to speculate about larger political and social consequences. So bringing a bit of the ethics there as well. So this was during the jury, and I do have to say beauty actually really matters, I think, because when we entered the space, I think all the jury members almost immediately, within 10 seconds, had made their top 3, and all the other designs that were not in that top 3 were just doomed, right? There was just no way that if the model was not convincing in this next 10 seconds, there would have had to be a lot of material behind the model to convince the jury. So these 3 designs were almost immediately singled out and put together. The jury, so we have Philip Block on the left from the ETH, who was really kind of approaching the designs very much from an engineering standpoint. Then we have Sille looking very skeptical as an advisor. Mikkel Tuur, who was, I think, contributing more from a kind of architectural, practicing architect point of view, and Areti, who was focusing on kind of social aspects and this idea of the primitive hut. And I'm just going to run through like a few through the top 3, but also just top 4, because top 4 was my favorite, which did not get chosen by Casey Rem, which was a project based on CLT panels and a kind of robotic assembly of CLT panels that will be assembled in this kind of structure that on the one hand is very familiar and on the other hand is slightly alien. And then the 3rd prize was by Jose Sanchez, who really proposed, I think he ticked all the boxes for the brief, so he had really set up quite an advanced conceptual agenda around the work that was based on a gaming platform that would engage all the inhabitants in Tallinn to think together and think collectively about the design. So the design would in a way be kind of crowdsourced from a community of people. And to do that, he had developed a kit of parts, so a kit of joints and timber struts that served as a kind of a platform that then people would come up with their own designs. Unfortunately, the jury was skeptical on the one hand about the material system because it relied on a kind of a very heavy steel joint, whereas actually with timber, one of the fantastic aspects of timber is that you could actually join it without adding any other material. So he thought that the joint, which would have to be prefabricated in China and then shipped over to Tallinn, that this was a bit of almost a kind of an internal contradiction with this idea of a very quick and simple building kit. Then the 2nd design was this one by Deborah Lopez and Hadin Charbel. And this one also ticked kind of all the boxes, and it proposed really this idea of this primitive production chain, but in a very contemporary way. So the idea was that within the limited budget of the Pavilion competition, that they would actually purchase Euro pallets, discarded Euro pallets, which you can buy, almost for €0.50 per pallet. They would then decode these pallets, take them apart into the separate chunks. They would color code them, and they would use also an augmented reality setup to then reassemble all of these Euro pallets in a kind of a cave-like space. And there was actually kind of an interesting and weird idea. They called it expired beauty. So the idea was that they were actually going to color code the Euro pallets with food waste, which was going to be a smelly business probably. But I think there was a kind of a really interesting way of thinking about the contemporary flow of materials around the world, which are these Euro pallets. So like 1 Euro pallet probably travels more than any of us will do over their lifetime, continuously being sent back and forth around the world. It's obviously one of the most famous kind of standardized elements in the world. Like this kind of simple Euro pallet facilitates global logistics around the world, and it communicates between different countries. Now with Brexit, they want to get rid of the Euro pallet. They want to have their own pallets. So it's a very kind of interesting contemporary production chain. And then we also thought that, so despite of this story, I think there was really kind of a deep interest in kind of beauty and the kind of the idea of playing with these high resolution organizations of these fragments of Euro pallets that then produce this kind of articulated rustic form. However, the jury also kind of deemed then that this was maybe too familiar in its kind of tectonics and in a way not challenging enough for the Biennale. Like we wanted then something that would really, really push and challenge the way how this would be built. I'm not going to describe so much this one because we have the authors on stage, but just kind of the way how we understood this as a primitive hut was the initial idea that you could almost directly go from the forest from pure timber, adding a bit of algorithm on top, and send it to a HoloLens, and then assemble it into this structure, which is this extremely, extremely short production chain. Of course, we need to question now with these guys how much that worked out, but I think, again, if you look at these renderings and we look at the Pavilion today, is an extremely kind of successful translation. And as a last challenge, because my time is up, is for the debate, then the question that if architecture is not meant to be a one-off, the idea that every primitive hut is also universal per se, the question of how can we actually multiply this kind of beauty, and how can we extract something from this pavilion that goes beyond the single building. So I'll give the word now to Gwil, Igor, Cam, and Soomeen.
Thanks, Jill. I'll be presenting the pavilion, but of course it's a collaborative design exercise, so afterwards we can all discuss it, but just for simplicity, I'm the chosen one for today. So, let's see if this works this time. Perfect. So the pavilion is, it's designed and built entirely by hand using very, very primitive analog tools and kind of arcane techniques of fabrication, really. So steam-bent strips of ash and hand-bent pieces of stainless steel. It's around and about 4.5 meters high, so we're trying to sort of push the scale of what you can do when you work entirely by hand with primitive tools, utilizing holographic guides to try to reduce the risk of constructing quite complex forms in this way without being able to rely on, say, CNC tools, which offer you a precision which you just simply can't obtain when working by hand. There's a whole lot of qualities and effects in the architecture, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that we were sort of interested in, these kind of ambiguous ideas of walls becoming ceiling spaces, of columns twisting and becoming inhabitable, playing with poche, things like that. But what you don't usually see, I guess, or what we don't usually show, is the reality of how these things get built. And it's an incredibly kind of messy process where spending 2 months, often in the rain, wearing HoloLens headsets, which are really designed to be used in executive offices to convince clients to buy things. We're wearing them and just trying to dodge these, constant buckets of water which are falling on our head. It's a muddy site. We're trying to work out why pieces don't fit or why timber is a different shape. We're slipping on tools. It's this incredibly kind of experiential build process, and so I want to kind of unpack some of the technologies that we developed that facilitate working in this way. So we can do something in a very kind of unskilled, low-tech way on a messy site with little preparation and still be able to realize this project. Another thing that I have to mention really quickly is that not only is it a design collaboration, but we had an enormous team of people working on this project, not just here in Tallinn, but also in America, where we did workshops to prototype parts of the pavilion, and in Denmark, where Dagmar Reinhardt and Ryan Hughes were sort of instrumental in giving us an opportunity to figure out how to actually build this thing and make it work. And we had 2 people in particular who were working for us and with us for the entire 2 months. And that is Sean Guy and Hanjun Kim, who also, without their help and incredibly dogged determination, this project wouldn't have been built. It's a ton of work. I think I only need to mention one of these things. It's 5,000 bolts, which are all put in entirely by hand, and we had to build a completely different pavilion before we could even start doing our pavilion. So really just masses and masses of work. So I skipped this slide yesterday because I couldn't use the clicker, but something that we're sort of interested in doing with the pavilion is utilizing augmented reality for manufacturing and construction, which is how that technology, since its conception, was intended to be used. So 2 Boeing engineers back in the 90s invented the term augmented reality to describe a system for helping aircraft manufacturers construct complex parts of aircraft. We've had a crack at this over the last few years, utilising commercially available headsets like the Microsoft HoloLens, so doing things like complex steelwork or trying to roll this technology out in industry to assist with, say, complex masonry construction. We hadn't done anything with timber, or at least nothing really complex, and so the sort of fundamental idea of the Pavilion was to simplify the process of steam bending, like get rid of the expensive one-off molds and produce a sort of universal formwork system that you could adapt with an AR model in order to produce something wildly sort of complex and wonderful like this, which is typically paper architecture. We've all seen these sorts of design languages before, but we haven't seen so many of them built just because they'd be expensive and difficult. As Jill mentioned before, the idea of the sort of construction of this pavilion or the production chain is really simple. We take standard lengths of timber, standard lengths of steel, and we bend them into every part in the pavilion. How that works technically is we have a digital model of each part, and we place that digital model in space as a hologram that you can see when you wear the headset. And there's a really sort of craft-based process associated with fabricating each one of these elements from a very precise digital guide. So what we're doing is taking a 12-metre long piece of timber, it's steaming in a bag, which is one of the kind of innovations that we had to develop in order to build this pavilion. It gives you more time to bend each piece, and you're massaging this piece while it steams into, as close as you possibly can, the shape of each piece of timber in the structure. And this is a sort of an exercise in choreography. So here Igor is wearing the headset and he's trying to kind of direct a whole lot of people who can't see what he sees to bend and weave this piece of timber into the shape that it should be. So I think it's quite interesting that we're sort of utilising very, very precise digital models to create quite approximate physical parts. This is a sort of an inversion of how the digital models are normally used in architecture and construction. And we never get each piece exactly right, we just get it close enough. And it means it's this sort of, it's just like handcraft. You're reacting to the material all the time, you're working with the limitations of your skill. When we're making the steel brackets, these needed to be more accurate, and so we developed a more sophisticated digital tool for assisting with their fabrication. So here you see a volunteer, he's interacting with some holographic user interfaces, selecting parts of the design to be fabricated, and then stepping through each bend for each part, which shows him exactly the shape that the bracket needs to be before and after each bend, and allows him to line up the physical piece with the digital model and always know whether or not what he's fabricating just by hand is exactly what it should be in the digital model. So this requires very little skill, it's quite fun, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. So again, it's a kind of, because you understand the spring back of the steel, the limitations of the bender, how to do things quickly. Assembling these on site, you need more holographic information. So each bracket is unique, it goes in a unique position in space, it's attaching to timber boards which aren't necessarily precise, and so we're trying to kind of massage the assembly of this structure together following a holographic reference which shows us where everything needs to be. This is because the timber parts, when they get to site, look like this, even though they're accurately steam bent. When you take them apart, put them back together, the weight of the timber pulls it into a different shape. These aren't rigid objects, and so this looks absolutely nothing like what it should be once it's installed on the footings. So we have another holographic model showing us how each piece of timber should look. The timber itself, it weaves through the structure. This is not a kind of a simple additive process of construction, and so again, you need that reference showing you what the design intent should be in order to sort of faithfully recreate the effects of the design. We needed to climb on the structure, and we couldn't build it accurately. That meant that, well, you know, it's accurately matching the design intent, but sometimes it's not accurate enough to fit the steel brackets in place and brace the structure. So we were constantly creating digital models from the as-built form of the pavilion in order to generate new pieces of steel that would brace it where it was sort of critical. And that meant that we could do things like climb on the structure, re-digitize parts of the structure. We fabricated brackets just on site because, again, we're working with simple tools. So we brought the bender to site, we brought some steel to site, and we were able to then effectively create digital models which allowed us to brace the structure wherever it was needed. So a few of the qualities and effects of the architecture. I mean, we're imagining that this thing is spatial. It produces spaces, even though you can't occupy those spaces because of the safety constraints of the pavilion. So we're kind of interested in generating things which are readable from the street. So as you drive past the site, where trucks are constantly driving past it, you get one reading of the structure. As you walk through it, you begin to understand the qualities of the material. So the secondary cladding has a kind of a sheen which contrasts with the roughness of the steam bent ash. We're also trying to activate the site in some way. So the plan is sort of like a cross, which creates these spaces around the pavilion, frames views of the city, encourages you to walk through it, understand the ways these different elements of its architecture blend and twist and contort. And it's trying to be a kind of a contribution to the built culture of this city. So there's a sort of a tradition of craft here, which I hope this pavilion makes some kind of contribution to in its sort of its language and in its roughness. I've managed to finish 30 seconds early. I'm quite proud of that. But this last or second last image of the pavilion, somebody nicknamed this the elephant view. Now that I've seen the elephant view, I can't ever unsee it. But okay, thanks very much.
Thank you both. I wanted to open up the conversation where Gilles maybe started around the notion of the primitive hut, and whether there's something within the primitive hut that drives an understanding of the analogue, but also something that drives an understanding of the vernacular. And often the primitive hut is built from what is readily available around you. And I'm interested perhaps in what this pavilion suggests within that realm of the contextual, and also perhaps how it's a Tallinn pavilion, and what it makes as a contribution to its place is as much from perhaps its materiality as is its formal language and what it's doing in that place. So sort of two bits really, and anyone can answer.
I mean, there's two answers to this question. So one is the name of the project is very ugly, I think, because it's literal, to play off the discussion yesterday. Steampunk, it's very literally about this kind of combination of the analogue and the raw with the highly technical, like the almost mystical and magical. I think in that way it's definitely picking up on the context of Tallinn. I mean, Tallinn is known internationally as being this kind of technological hub. But also there's a sort of a tradition of timber work here, which we were interested in dealing with. It's sort of a pretty simple idea. We talked to artists and fabricators who'd worked in Tallinn, who'd done a lot of work with timber, and they were encouraging us to work with plywood, essentially, as Jill did last time, because there's this sort of rich, I guess, there's a history of innovation with plywood here, but we wanted to sort of look back a little bit further into the past, if you like, because we all have an interest in kind of engaging with really craft-based techniques, and I didn't want to utilise what was kind of a technological innovation of ply construction here. I wanted to look back further.
Maybe can I kind of intervene with one there? So, what's like? Would you say that in one way that pavilion is a bit nostalgic? Because it's about, craft, the past. And we had this debate 2 days ago with Mario Carpo and Antoine Picon, where there was a kind of a real dialectic between Antoine saying that, craft is even, it's highly questionable and we should have a political problem even with craft. Whereas Mario was kind of proposing this idea which has been lingering around for 2 decades in the digital, that the digital will make us this cathedral builders, this digital craftsmen, who in a kind of a happy world, we will all be kind of enjoying our labor, and labor is not anymore something we should even be paid for, but labor is something we do it for fun, and this kind of nostalgic medieval world where no one's labor was abused. So I wanted to kind of maybe, I mean, all of you maybe speculate a bit on this notion of craft and this notion of labor, and kind of answer the question, maybe, is this a bit nostalgic, you know?
I think instead of being nostalgic, I think it's also, it's kind of provoking or questioning the way we are developing the digital fabrication nowadays, considering the use of machine, use of robots. Most of them are becoming, most of them kind of simplifies the processes or simplifies the parts too much, and there is ignorance of the making processes, the nature of the complexity of the making processes. So that's why it's not, let's say, not nostalgic, but learning from the traditional craftsmanships, because they have developed really good skills, and how much we can learn from those, I think that's what we want to question. And instead of being maybe nostalgic, but trying to bring those kind of qualities and making processes back, and can they also be digital and be also kind of part of today's construction processes. I think that's what we try to merge through the use of augmentation or augmented devices and softwares to kind of bridge these two things. How can the traditional crafts and traditional ways of using material very smartly, very beautifully, and connect back to today's new aesthetics and new kind of powerful tools that we can use from the computer power and technology.
I think, though, in that there is a conversation that I suppose came up briefly late yesterday around what is the difference between skilled labour and unskilled labour, and what is the difference between augmenting a skilled labourer versus a bunch of architecture students wandering around trying to bend bits of wood. And I think there's a tension there about both the original intent of augmented reality, but equally within this idea of experimentation.
Yeah. But I think for me, I'm more interested in the comparison between mechanic processes and human process, instead of just comparing skilled or unskilled labor of human, because we are obviously skilled labor will make much better and faster, even using same augmented devices. But compared to any robotic processes to make the same thing, I think using human labor really enabled us to produce this kind of structure, let's say comparably and relatively with faster or shorter preparation time.
I mean, I think the labour may be unskilled. The architecture students' labour, they don't know anything about anything. But on the other hand, the digital expertise, which is enabling that labour to produce these parts, is highly skilled. So there's a kind of it's quite interesting, I think, what the architecture students may get out of working with the augmented reality instructions, bending each part, doing quite simple tasks, which are unskilled, is they have an opportunity to see how they might be able to design differently for somebody else to then go and realise those parts, who needs to be much more skilled than they are in order to do it without the supervision of the architect. So I think what we're doing with this project is combining the digital expertise, like Cam's expertise, with the unskilled fabrication expertise. But for the architecture students participating in that process, they see an opportunity to sort of flip that in their own practice, I think.
I'm interested, Gilles, in your watching these guys struggling in the rain, perhaps reflecting on what you went through in the construction of your pavilion.
And it's, for me, it's really, really interesting, because I think both the pavilion 2 years ago and the pavilion constructed this year are articulating kind of two ways how we could think about digital tools, or like about the digital in architecture. So mine was explicitly framed in a context of automation and the idea that we did not want to spend 2 months in Tallinn, right? We went 2 times for 4 days with 4 people, and it was done, right? And of course, we were also willing to compromise on kind of, I mean, I wouldn't say actually compromise, but we were willing to kind of tune it down a bit and be like, okay, you know, we're happy enough with we don't need like the game is not extreme exuberance, right? The game is actually this kind of condition where you want to level out the material, the effort, the labor, etc. And then I think the other approach, like this one, I think is extremely fascinating. But for me, it takes a very different approach towards understanding labor, to also defining what we're actually looking for. Like I think it's quite different what we're looking for, and that's also kind of the question that I want to bring back to you guys. Is now that this pavilion is done, what do we extrapolate from this for a larger community? How can we? What are the kind of the values that with this pavilion we want to carry out of this biennale?
I mean, I guess it doesn't need to necessarily be kind of use of the exactly same material system, but it's more about, I would say, kind of the process and learning about the new ways and methodologies of constructing, let's say, vernacular architecture, or like going on site, seeing what is out there and using just the kind of locally sourced materials, for example. Whereas if you would imagine kind of the agenda of on-site robotic fabrication that was very popular in the last decade, you would imagine bringing a very expensive robot which doesn't really work in the local conditions, having to program it for a specific type of material, whereas kind of just going there with the augmented reality tools, you would basically enable skilled or unskilled labor, in that sense doesn't really matter, to kind of construct habitats or whatever is there.
Cam, do you want to, in the 10 seconds we have left, chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say I think it opens an opportunity to think really creatively about how new technologies are applied to kind of older, well, not necessarily even older techniques, just techniques that aren't typically considered to be overly digital. Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting things here is that I don't think the pavilion is going away as a building typology. I think that we're continually excited by building these little pieces of architecture because they're fun. You know, it gives you a chance to prototype, it gives you a chance to experiment. And I think certainly from this one, I think there's a great deal of that that's coming out of it. And I think the longevity of this as a building typology is probably more tied into what happens with that pavilion next. Where does it go? Where do the bits end up?
So are you willing to disassemble it and build it again somewhere else?
Okay, fantastic. Our time is up. Thank you all very much for getting up early and coming to the first session. And we will continue from here. Thank you.